Good afternoon and welcome to today's keyword lecture, Madness, Psychiatry and Civil Rights in the Jim Crow South. A special welcome to all those who are joining us from across the country via our live stream. My name is Maeve Loza-Lyons, and I'm the Associate Director of the Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry, the home of the Keyword series. I'm delighted to be with you all today and to have the privilege of introducing this event and today's speaker. The Keyword series is a new initiative for us this year and furthers our aims of connecting faculty in the humanities with new audiences and providing opportunities for our community, both in and beyond the university, to hear directly from faculty about their areas of expertise. We know that humanistic inquiry is most valuable when its findings are shared and can stimulate new conversations. Each of our keywords are selected and presented by one of our former faculty, fellows, and residents, and they can take different forms, from research seminars to evening classes to lectures such as this. The unifying thread is that each takes a single concept or idea, often expanded with a subtitle, and explores it from a particular vantage point. This is our fifth keyword event of the year, following Negativity with Professor Elizabeth Wilson, Race with Professor Michelle Armstrong-Partida, Habits with Professor Judd Owen, and Shtetl with Professor Ellie Schenker. Our final keyword of the year, Regendering with Professor Susan Hyland, will take place in North Decatur Presbyterian Church over 4 evenings this June and will explore gender norms in the New Testament period. Registration for that series opens tomorrow, and for more information on how to register or to learn more about our other programs and activities, please visit our website. Turning now to today's program, it is my enormous pleasure to introduce Dr. Kylie Smith, Associate Professor in the Woodruff School of Nursing and Associated Faculty in the Emory College Department of History. Professor Smith received her PhD from the University of Wollongong in New South Wales, Australia, and came to Emory in 2015 as the inaugural Andrew W. Mellon Faculty Fellow in Nursing and Humanities. Her first book, Talking Therapy, Knowledge and Power in American Psychiatric Nursing, won the Lavinia L. Dock Award from the American Association for the History of Nursing and the American Journal of Nursing's Book of the Year Award in the area of history and public policy. Professor Smith's work exemplifies how humanities research can inform better policymaking in real-world contexts, in this case, mental health care. And it was to this end that she founded the Center for Healthcare History and Policy, which supports collaboration, knowledge sharing, and community building across Emory University and Emory Healthcare. She says, to administer effective healthcare, you have to be able to understand humans and their complexities. Many healthcare problems we are trying to fix are caused by historical or policy issues, so you really can't get the whole picture if you're not thinking about how it got this way. The work she'll share with us today draws on research for her forthcoming book, Jim Crow in the Asylum, Psychiatry and Civil Rights in the American South, which will be published by the University of North Carolina Press this fall. Thanks to a grant from the Digital Publishing and the Humanities Program, this book will be released both in print and in a free ebook to ensure that anyone who would like to read it will have the opportunity. The importance of this research was spotted early on when an editor chased Kylie down the hall at a conference to ask whether she had a publisher for the book yet. At the time, the project was in its infancy and she had little more than a conference presentation. Happily for us, she took that editor's suggestion to heart and dove into the work we'll hear about today. Please join me in offering a warm welcome to Professor Kylie Smith.
Thank you for that lovely welcome, and shout out to said editor Lucas Church at UNC Press. I'm very grateful for his faith in this project. So I want to thank you so much for being here today. I'm very grateful to the Fox Center for this chance to talk to you, and also for their continued support of my book project, Jim Crow in the Asylum, Psychiatry and Civil Rights in the American South, which is now a bit of a mouthful. In 2020, I was the President's Humanities Fellow at the Fox Center, and I got to spend a truly blissful academic year in that beautiful big room on the ground floor of the Yellow House on North Decatur Road. And the book has been doubly supported by the Fox Center through its inclusion in the Digital Publishing in the Humanities program. I'm very grateful to first Sarah McKee and now Maeve Loza-Lyons for supporting my desire to publish the book open access and as an enhanced digital monograph. I also need to thank the National Library of Medicine for their grant support of this project, the one and only grant for health historians from the NIH, which is probably dead now. I am happy to report, though, that the book is in fact finished and is in production as we speak and will be out this fall. So when I first started writing this talk a few weeks ago, I started to write a long introductory paragraph that set out the gaps in the current scholarship, which framed my interest in and approach to this topic. But the last month has both shaken my belief in the power of history to change anything, and at the same time strengthened my resolve to at least keep trying. So I'm just going to cut to the chase and lay out my motivation for writing this book, and then I'll try and give a few key insights into what I found along the way. The new Secretary for Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., put out a statement for his vision of how to make America healthy again. Leaving aside the again part, he invoked an old rhetoric of scientific racism when he suggested that African Americans should be on a different vaccine schedule to white people. He then paid particular attention to the so-called threat of psychiatric medication, especially for young people, and suggested that the cure for these problems were what he called wellness camps, where people could be reparented and re-educated. Of course, any historian of 20th century Europe will see that rhetoric for what it is and be chilled to the bone at the reference to gulags and concentration camps. But it is also the case that Kennedy is, maybe unknowingly, invoking a very particular American history, which historians of psychiatry like myself have long tried to document. America has had wellness camps before. They were called training schools or asylums or state hospitals, and they operated on false beliefs about racial difference, supported violence and abuse, and made money for the state off the back of forced labor, mostly Black patients. One of the first things I found in my research was this photo from the 1954, not 1854, annual report to the Board of Trustees from the Superintendent of Alabama's psychiatric hospitals. It took me by surprise, not because of the fact of patients being put to work. That has a long history in the psychiatric system and has been called various names: moral treatment, occupational therapy, vocational rehabilitation, whatever, however you want to dress it up. What was so striking to me about this image was its evocation of a much more sinister American tradition, the plantation. In fact, this farm, called the State Farm Colony for Negro Patients, was also called the Jemison Center, as if there was actual therapy going on there, and it was built on the exact same site as the Jemison plantation. The Jemison family had a long history around Tuscaloosa as part of the planter and enslaving class. One of the people that Jemison had enslaved was an engineer who designed the first bridge to cross the Black Warrior River between Tuscaloosa and Northport, which is where this plantation is. The Jemison Center is still there in Northport, abandoned and boarded up. You can find it if you know where to look. This is the same driveway as in the previous shot, and I took this photo myself a couple of years ago. So this location housed hundreds of Black men who were called patients, and administration put them to work picking cotton. I'm not sure how to call this anything other than a plantation, frankly. But to think about the connection between psychiatry and the plantation is not really new. And forced labor is not the only manifestation of plantation relations. As I teach my students, some of whom are here, every semester, psychiatry was shaped in the US by its engagement and imbrication with slavery and the work of slave doctors and apologists like Samuel Cartwright, who argued that the enslaved person was too psychologically simplistic and childlike to withstand the demands of freedom, and that they were better cared for and happier under slavery. In that logic, it was easy for Cartwright to give running away from slavery a fancy name like drapetomania and call the desire for a freedom a mental illness. In his work on slavery and social death, Orlando Patterson has documented the ways that plantation systems are reified by a reliance on the, quote, permanent and violent domination of natal alienated and generally dishonored persons. In my research, I saw these relationships play out in Southern asylums over and over again, reinforced by the internal racism of psychiatry itself. By this, I mean that it's not simply that the South was unfortunately racist and therefore its hospitals were. Rather, what happened in asylums happened because psychiatry allowed it, because psychiatry was central to ideas about normalcy and citizenship. Psychiatry was part of the project that defined race. Its practitioners argued that Blackness itself was a kind of madness, and they've perpetuated ideas about the Black body mind as different from and inferior to white ones in ways which allowed violence, abuse, neglect, and misdiagnosis. In 2021, like many other professional health and medical associations, the American Psychiatric Association made a pretty lame apology for its part in perpetuating harm through past racisms. The further I dug into the archives, the more I realized that the APA had no idea about the extent of its own complicity or the amount of damage that had been done. I began to think about this project as more than just a history of mental health policy, but as a kind of repertory history, the sort of history that David Scott argues should make explicit links between the past and the present. In his work in Small Acts, Scott argues is referring to the type of history that is, quote, concerned with those historical evils and injustices that remain unrepaired in the present, whose wrongs continue to disfigure generations of human lives, and that seeks to reconstruct these evil and unjust pasts in ways that potentially enable us to rethink the moral responsibility that the present owes in respect of them. So it's not just slavery that is the subject of reparatory history, but the racism that goes along with it. Racism in psychiatry is alive and well, evident in the overdiagnosis of Black folks with schizophrenia for no scientific reason, and the killing of those people, like LaShawn Thompson, in places like Fulton County Jail. So I imagined this project then as a way to inform current clinicians about the long and troublesome legacy of their practices, and to remind policymakers that rebuilding the asylum is not the answer. The horrors of American asylums are well known. They were well known even at the time. I'm often asked if the Southern asylums I study were any worse than the Northern ones, and the answer is both yes and no. If, as Albert Deutsch wrote in 1948, the problems at Central State Hospital in Milledgeville, here in Georgia, for example, were no different in nature than all the problems everywhere, they were at least different in scale. And if they were bad for white people, they were significantly worse for Black folks. Deutsch thought so himself at the time, continually commenting on the discrepancies between Black and white facilities at Milledgeville, in which he noted, quote, the hypocritical, separate but equal Jim Crow law of Georgia at work. But Milledgeville was not actually the worst of it. And I'm not the first person to make the links between the plantation system and the psychiatric one. In fact, people made that connection at the time. In 1947, Mr. Hull Watkins, a white man working at the Mississippi State Hospital in Whitfield, wrote this letter to the NAACP head office in New York City. Dear sirs, I've been chief of patrol at the state hospital for the insane people at Whitfield Miss for several months, and they're making slaves of the colored patient out there. They work them from before day to after dark. One of the big shots by the name of Stagg shot one of the patient eyes out, and the day superintendent by the name of Smith carry a gun all the time. So, I found this letter in the NAACP archives at the Library of Congress, and it kind of, sent chills through me at the time. It was one of those archival moments where you think, oh my God, like I found something truly incredible, and then also at the same time, something truly terrible. If I was excited at the discovery of Mr. Watkins' letter and the power it helped to help me make my argument, I quickly realized that that excitement couldn't come at the expense of those patients, the real people who were the subject of that violence. Mr. Watkins' letter sounded an immediate warning to me about the ethics of writing about violence in the past and how to do reparatory history that isn't also a kind of trauma porn. So I take my lead from Sadia Hartman, who asks the question, how and why do we write a history of violence? Hartman actively encourages repertory history, arguing that we must write our histories without fear or favor, but she warns that this approach does not give us carte blanche to recreate trauma or exploit our subjects, and that we must try to imagine what life was really like for the people who suffered and resisted. As you can imagine, though, the perspectives of actual patients is extremely rare in Southern psychiatric archives. Trullo's four-pronged analysis of how power works to create archival and historical silences were evident in every archive I worked in. There were times when those silences were so profound, I didn't think this book would be possible. But over the 7 years it's taken me to research and write the book, I got better at reading against the grain. And so the rest of my talk is focused around some key pieces of evidence that show the ways that Black patients, families, and activists responded to the violence, abuse, and neglect that was caused by the intersection of Southern white supremacy and psychiatry's own internal racism. Rather than focusing solely on all the horrible ways that social death and plantation relations were enacted, there are so many of them, I want to try and show how people responded and resisted, not always politically, but always at the level of reasserting their humanity and community and using their claims to rights as US citizens. In the same box as Mr. Watkins' letter to the NAACP, there are a number of letters from patients and workers in many of the nation's psychiatric hospitals complaining about the treatment of Black patients, complaining about the lack of due process rights and the conditions of their confinement. But all of those letters were from white people, except for one, and that came from Central State Hospital here in Georgia. So that is how, and it's on this tiny little slip of paper. So I'm going to try and translate it. So in 1952, I'll just call him Mr. M, wrote the following letter. Dear NAACP, I would like to have a job with you all. I am here, have been here for 10 years, working hard for 9 years. My father has been dead for 6 years, and I do not know nobody to sign me out of this place. I will stay with them and pay your time to get me out of here. I will work Jacksonville, Florida. Anywhere you has got a job for me, I'm willing to work. I do work hard and don't get anything for it at all. At the hall, Dr. Smith and Dr. Peacock, the superintendent of Milledgeville State Hospital, have me out on the road working 5.5 days a week. So the existence of this letter in the NAACP records indicates both the possibilities and difficulties of resistance and agency for Black patients, and the scarcity of the records that document their lived experience. The content of Mr. M's letter gives us a glimpse of that reality, highlighting the way that Black patients were seen as a biddable workforce rather than as a patient population requiring treatment. In Southern asylums, Black patients were positioned beyond therapy. Their everyday lives in the institution were shaped by the long history of this plantation, slavery, and sharecropping in the South, where the Black body and mind were considered suitable only for hard work for the benefit of white people. Mr. M's letter demonstrates this firsthand. He speaks only of his life at Milledgeville as a worker, not as a patient. He knew he had rights and a course of appeal. He knew to write to the NAACP. But when he did so, his appeal for release was based on the way that he saw himself as a good worker, not that he was cured of whatever he was originally committed for. When I talk about archival silences, people often ask me if I maybe should use material culture to recreate or imagine the lives of Black patients. But I think this is to basically misunderstand the nature of their lives in these hospitals and the nature of record keeping about those lives. It has been incredibly frustrating, for example, to discover that the patients at Central State Hospital created not one but two patient newsletters, the Builder produced by white patients and the Golden Star produced by Black patients. A single journal article written about the history of the Builder uses items held in a private collection. And I was told, no, go away. And echoing my own research, those authors were never able to find a single copy of the Golden Star. A patient newsletter from Bryce Hospital in Tuscaloosa ceased publication in the early 1900s, but I got lucky in Mississippi, which is a little unusual, where I found an uncensored collection of a short-lived patient newsletter from Whitfield Hospital. Called The Wit, the newsletter was the brainchild of the new superintendent, Dr. William Jackwith, who'd been a physician in the Pacific Theatre in World War II, and he was determined to improve the prisoner of war-like conditions he found when he took over Whitfield from 1949. The Wit ran from 1951 to 1956, and from its second edition, it included a few pages at the back, usually called Colored Patient News. Initially, the entries were written by staff, but patients themselves were encouraged to contribute And when they did, they made use of the page to reassert their humanity, to connect with friends and loved ones, and to remind readers that they were, in fact, patients with jobs, communities, and families they hoped to return to. For example, in April of 1952, 10 patients in the coloured male disturbed ward all made these simple two-line entries that stated their desire to get well and go home. I'm very glad for a place to get well so I can go back home, wrote Eddie. Jimmy Lee added, I just wait every day to hear my doctor say I can go home. These sentiments were repeated by Tom, Willie, Richard, John, Benny, Ollie, Jeff, and Cornell. And in a particularly powerful note, in March 1952, one patient went to great lengths to remind readers of the humanity of patients like himself when he wrote, I, Klondike A, of coloured male epileptic, came to this hospital in July 1950, and this past month, which was February 18, was my birthday, and I'm 41 years old. My home is in Coahoma County. He also pointed out that two of his fellow patients, Freeman and Walter, who were unable to write, also had birthdays in February, and that to Klondike, the patients in the coloured male epileptic ward constituted, quote, our family of 100. Comments like these demonstrate that patients were cognizant of and self-aware about their situation, and also show that they came from a broad variety of backgrounds with complex lives. In the same edition, Willie J wrote, I have improved since I came here, have been here for over a month. I will be glad when I can be at home so I can provide for my wife and child and continue my medical course, which was interrupted by my illness. Willie J's comment demonstrates the way that he understood himself distinctly as a patient who had a life to return to, and gives a tiny glimpse into the impact of mental illness for Black families. Repeated postings across multiple volumes of the Wit show the way that patients referred to themselves as sick, well, or improving, and demonstrate a clear expectation that they would be treated like patients, that they were there to recover and expected to be able to go home. They also demonstrate the determination of Black patients to maintain social relationships that linked them to each other and to their communities of origin. Those communities were really vital for patients who often found themselves confined and committed against their will. Black patients were particularly vulnerable to the lack of due process. But I have two stories that show the importance of both newspaper reporting and the networks of kin that helped Black patients navigate these systems. The first story is from Whitfield, when under the directorship of Dr. Jaquith, who was supported in his campaign for improved conditions at Whitfield by the editor of the Greenville Delta Democrat Times, Harding Carter Jr., a very famous newspaperman. On the front page of the September 4, 1949 edition, Carter wrote a long piece about attempts at reform at Whitfield and the need for more funding. So this is the front page. Situated next to that report, he also printed a story about a Black woman named Emma Wright. She had been admitted to Whitfield with bruises and other injuries after spending some months in the Washington County Jail after allegedly killing her baby. She was first reported to a local policeman who called the deputy sheriff, who took her to the county jail in Grenville, where she appeared before Justice of the Peace Tom Mosley, who said, as soon as we saw this woman, we knew that she was crazy. Mosley said that he turned the case completely over to the sheriff, expecting her to be committed to Whitfield. But the jail officials themselves took a different view. The sheriff said, I love how he's qualified, so she didn't seem crazy when she got to the jail. And the jailer, J.W. McElwee, reported, quote, that for a long while the woman seemed to be fine, and we put her in with the other women and let her do some washing and ironing. An anonymous citizen raised concerns that she was kept at the jail, quote, because they liked her and she did washing for them. That person managed to get the attention of county attorneys who had her seen by two Greenville doctors who suggested she be taken to Whitfield, which is where she should have been in the first place. Once at Whitfield, she was seen by Dr. Marshall, who was astonished that she'd not been brought immediately to the hospital. Both Dr. Marshall and Miss Wright's father were concerned about her condition when they discovered bruises, which she claimed were the results of being beaten by the police. It was only when she was committed to Whitfield that she was able to reconnect with her father, who had been looking for her. In both the physical placement and in the context of the story of Emma Wright, there's a glimpse of how these systems worked as a kind of parallel space for Black patients. Hotting Carter didn't bury the story. He put it in full view on page 1, right next to a story that talked about reforms at Whitfield. I have no idea what he was thinking in doing so, but it's a deliberate choice, as all editorial choices are. Emma Wright's story quite literally runs in parallel to the end of a long-running investigation that focused only on white patients, demonstrating the way that even newspapers performed Jim Crow on a daily basis. But the story also makes clear the processes that people had to negotiate when they actually needed help, and how in many instances the jail and hospital were interchangeable, and how easy it was for people to fall between the cracks. The second story I want to relate is from Alabama, and it's 20 years later. Processes of admission in Alabama were particularly problematic, made worse by the presence of 2 distinct facilities. This is Bryce Hospital in Tuscaloosa. You can see it backs onto the Black Warrior River, and this is actually now all the campus of the University of Alabama. And that main building in the middle with the little tower is now a visitor center. Bryce took white patients only, and all the state's Black patients were moved to Searcy Hospital, an old Civil War barracks in Mount Vernon, about 30 miles north of Mobile in the state's far south. Even though Alabama technically had a legal form of commitment, unlike Mississippi's medical process, that was still really easily subverted. The story of Inez Pruitt in Alabama shows the way that these processes could be problematic, but also resisted, and demonstrate the importance of local civil rights activists. Miss Pruitt's case was closely followed by the civil rights newspaper, the Southern Courier. Established by journalism students from Harvard who had come south during Freedom Summer, the paper covered medical segregation closely and was active in investigations of Alabama's psychiatric hospitals. In June of 1967, the newspaper reported that Miss Pruitt had made inquiries at the Mobile County Welfare Office about what she believed was a welfare check owed to her. She had no previous mental health kind of conditions at all. Welfare, she had been hospitalized with pneumonia and had a kind of a disability in her leg, but she'd been working as a housekeeper for a local white family. When the welfare officer denied she was owed any money and accused her of faking, Miss Pruitt reported that she made fun of my condition. She raised a leg to kick me. I lost my temper and hit her with my umbrella. I apologized later. Even though the welfare officer said she was not hurt by the umbrella, she also denied the abuse allegation. 4 days later, Miss Pruitt was randomly picked up by the police and taken to Mobile General Hospital, where she was examined by Dr. Thomas. Thomas, quote, looked her over and classified her a paranoid schizophrenic, and in the same breath said, but of course I'm no psychiatrist. From there, Miss Pruitt should have been seen by an actual psychiatrist at Mobile General, but instead she was transported directly to Searcy. When questioned about this process, the Mobile welfare officer said that it was doing her a favor. Under Alabama law, people were not entitled to welfare unless they were considered permanently disabled. And in pursuing committal to and diagnosis from Searcy, the welfare office argued that they were trying to get medical evidence that can get her on welfare for the rest of her life. Yet the reporter noted patients who had been committed to a mental hospital were not in fact entitled to welfare assistance at all. In one move, the local medical profession had rid themselves of a troublesome Black woman seeking assistance and put that assistance itself out of her reach. More than that, they condemned her to trauma, violence, and abuse. In a follow-up article 3 weeks later, the Southern Courier reported that Miss Pruitt had been denied medication for her blood pressure, was not able to control her diet, and that she had been strapped down and subjected to 3 rounds of electroshock treatment against her will. The article detailed the way that Miss Pruitt's sister and a white friend, Mrs. DuPont, had been to visit her multiple times and had conducted a stormy interview with Dr. Harry Rowe, assistant superintendent at Searcy. Rowe was unwilling to release Miss Pruitt without signed letters to the effect that her sister would be accountable for her and that no one at Searcy would be held responsible for her future behavior. Rowe claimed that she'd been violent against staff and, quote, did cause a bit of disturbance, but she was improving. Her defendants claimed that her acts of violence against staff were actually her fighting the forced electroshocks, which they claimed were illegal, but Rowe's counter-argument demonstrated the circular logic of carceral psychiatry when he claimed, quote, after a patient is legally committed, we give them the treatment we think they need. The fact that Miss Pruitt's commitment and so many others like hers were subject to the whim of local white practitioners with no actual legal due process appeared to escape Rowe's mind. As the assistant superintendent, his word was the only one that mattered. Miss Pruitt was finally released in June of 1967 and awarded a partial payment from the welfare department with help from a New York law student doing a civil rights internship. Her case demonstrates the active relationships between the local community and Cersei Hospital and the importance of the agitation of her sister and her white women friends, but it also hints at the impact of local civil rights activists who had been active in the South before and after Freedom Summer. One of the most important of those activists was John LaFleur, who had long been paying close attention to what was going on at Cersei. Since the early 1950s, when he was secretary of the Mobile branch of the NAACP, before the state banned that organization, LaFleur was active in agitating for better working and patient conditions at Cersei. On October 6, 1953, he wrote to Governor Persons of Alabama expressing his concern regarding rumors of tubercular patients not being separated from other patients at Cersei, which he posed as a common sense public health problem. He then raised issues about pay and conditions of employees, including the salary differential between white and Black attendants, and pointed out that the living conditions for Black employees were considerably worse than for white ones, even though they paid the same amount for board and lodging. LaFleur's final point to the governor highlighted the need for more Black doctors in order to bring about some kind of racial parity in both the workforce and in approaches to patient care. Most significant, though, about this letter is its date. Prefacing both the Brown versus Board decision and the formal medical civil rights movement, LaFleur's letter is an important indicator of the way that grassroots activists were extremely proactive in their fight against segregation, well before laws existed to support them. So even though it's got marks all over it, the letter was actually ignored, so he never received a reply from Governor Persons, but he didn't give up. From 1965, as part of his work as the chair of the Citizens Committee of the Nonpartisan Voters League, which was the replacement for the NAACP, LaFleur again took up the cause of the workers and patients at Cersei Hospital. In June of that year, he wrote directly to Luther Terry, then Surgeon General of the Public Health Service, complaining of continued, quote, stubborn policies of racial segregation affecting both patients and employees at Cersei. LaFleur pointed out that not only were the hospitals racially segregated, but that abhorrent practices were in place, such as, quote, patients from the Cersei Hospital are alleged to be compelled to go to Tuscaloosa by bus to work on a farm operated by the White Hospital. That's the Jemison Center farm. So they would be admitted to Cersei, and if they were able-bodied, then they would literally be transported up to 170 miles north up to that farm, where they lived in like a ramshackle kind of shed. Anyway, LaFleur began to collect testimony from local families, including this affidavit from Mrs. Brown. Mrs. Brown wrote that her son, Joe Nathan Jr., who had been in Cersei briefly, had, quote, been beaten by two white hospital employees named Johnson and Newton. My son took his father and me to one of the toilets and showed us welts and blisters on his left buttock, which he said resulted from the two white men beating him up with a cut-off water hose. He explained that one of the men held him while the other one beat him after locking him up. So, beatings and abuse are a common problem across all overcrowded and badly managed psychiatric institutions, but Mrs. Brown was in no doubt about the racial implications of this attack, which she believed, quote, was due to strong race prejudice. In fact, in view of the fact that a number of white employees of this hospital are alleged to be members of the Ku Klux Klan. She linked this action to the broader environment of racial violence around Mount Vernon, in which white employees of the hospital were in fact arrested only the previous week after participating in a Klan rally at Mount Vernon and shooting into the house of a local Black woman and attempting to burn her house down. So this report from Mrs. Brown was not mere anecdote. Local newspapers carried the story as well. LaFleur often used his position on the editorial board of the Mobile Beacon to raise awareness about issues related to discrimination at the hospital for both staff and patients. The Beacon covered the story about the Klan activity on August 6, 1966, in an article entitled Klan Terrorists Hit Mobile County, and reported that John Henry Newton, a known member of the local Klan, was arrested for his role in the shooting and attempted burning. Newton, the Beacon reported, is said to be 18 years of age and to have recently had coloured playmates. Was released Monday on $2,000 bond. He is charged with arson and the destruction of private property. This is the same Newton who Mrs. Brown had mentioned in her affidavit, but there's no consequence for the beating of a patient. The charged atmosphere around Mount Vernon and Cersei continued. A week later, the Mobile Beacon ran another front page story entitled Skirmish at Cersei Hospital Causes Stir. In this article, the Beacon reported that a Black employee, Willie Mays Jr., had been dismissed from Cersei because of an altercation with a white employee over the treatment of a patient. Mr. Mays, who worked in the kitchen at Cersei, reported, quote, "It was feed up time, and one of the male patients was seated at the table with his hat on. This white man said, 'What you doing with your hat on, boy?' And the judo chopped the patient as he snatched his hat. I called him where I was and said, 'You shouldn't hit patients like that.' And he said, 'What have you got to do with it?' and slapped me across the face. My eye is still bloodshot. Then I went into him." I'm a bit of a fan of Mr. Mays. There's a lot of context I could add here about the nature of the workforce in these hospitals, but I just use this incident in particular as a demonstration of the way that broader racial relationships, racial politics, affected relationships between patients and attendants. A Black patient at Cersei is attacked by a white attendant and then defended by a Black staff member who is then himself attacked. The incident demonstrates the potentially protective impact of Black staff, but it also demonstrates the prevailing environment of racial violence. Both men were fired, but the local community also saw the incident as part of a larger series of racially charged incidents. A number of area citizens converged on the hospital in protest at Mr. May's firing and the violence against patients, but were threatened with a call to the police chief. The article made a clear link between this incident at Cersei and the Klan, stating at the end that, quote, "Because of recent Klan activity in the area, it's reported that most Negroes have harmed themselves." But civil rights activists knew that violence, the tactic of the oppressor, would not help Black patients. For that, they needed the law. The greatest tool that activists like LaFleur had with which to force integration was the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Title VI of that act required all hospitals in the country to fill out this form in order to declare their compliance with the act. It's called voluntary compliance. Contrary to how it is being interpreted by some people at the moment, Title VI was not created to end discrimination against poor white people. Title VI was explicitly created to end the existing practice of using federal funds to actively discriminate against Black Americans and to make some attempt to repair the wrong that had been done to those people through segregation in health, education, and welfare services. Title VI also provided the federal government with the ability to enforce non-discrimination through both investigative and legal action. Perhaps unsurprisingly, both of those means of enforcement were required, especially in Alabama. In the face of massive resistance to the Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Unit of the Department of Health, Education and Welfare created a temporary office called the Office of Equal Health Opportunity, or OEHO. This small unit consisted of a group of dedicated civil rights lawyers within the department, and in the summer of 1966, an OEHO inspection team visited the psychiatric hospitals in Alabama. The inspection team, led by Marilyn Rose, was met with intimidation and violence, including being followed, having their cars tampered with, and witnesses' houses shot into. Rose recorded these incidents along with her memories of Cersei Hospital in this interview in 1999. She described the situation there as the worst the team had ever seen. She said services for patients at Cersei were custodial and the general wards were horrid. The administrator, Dr. Rowe, was obviously not conversant with modern psychiatry and seemed to be running a southern plantation. A visit to the wards suggested to me what one might have found in the 19th century at a time when mental patients were warehoused. The wards looked like prison cells. It was a scene out of a Kafka play. Rose reported these conditions back to the Civil Rights Office, and the state of Alabama was ordered to appear at an administrative hearing in Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1967. At this hearing, representatives from the state of Alabama argued that segregation in psychiatric facilities was medically justified for the safety and well-being of the patients, while expert witnesses for the Civil Rights Office, including both white and black clinicians and administrators, argued that that was just not true. At the end of the 2 days of hearings, the hearing examiner found Alabama in breach of the Civil Rights Act and ordered all mental health funding to the state be halted, which it was, and that also meant suspending new Medicare money. I'm seeing a pattern here. Rather than comply with Title VI, the state of Alabama then brought a court case against HEW claiming federal overreach. At the same time, John LaFleur had combined efforts with lawyers from the Legal Defense Fund, who also lodged a case on behalf of patients in Alabama. Those two cases were combined, creating this huge stack of files for me to read. I've read every single page. And those cases were heard by a 3-judge bench in the United States Middle District Court in Alabama, in Montgomery, led by Frank Johnson Jr. Judge Johnson was an Eisenhower appointment and possibly the most important judicial activist in Southern history. His staunch upholding of the Civil Rights Act was legendary, less a matter of personal opinion, but a fact of law. Again, unlike some people in the present moment, Johnson understood segregation to be illegal and unconstitutional. And in 1969, he ruled that it was not medically justified in Alabama's psychiatric hospitals. Ordered to report to the court every 6 months thereafter, Alabama's mental health services were finally deemed fully integrated in 1975. But the implementation of the Civil Rights Act could not erase the damage that had been done or the underlying racism inherent to psychiatry itself. So I want to finish today with an analysis of one final document, which exemplifies what I really want to say, I think, about the consequences of racism at the intersection with this concept of madness. So this document was it's a report written by Dr. Daryl Gay, who's a sociologist at Central State Hospital here in Milledgeville in Georgia, written in 1966. I just have to say I had the great pleasure of talking to Dr. Gay before he passed away a couple of years ago. He was really one of the most fantastic people I've ever spoken to. A Georgia native, went to Oglethorpe, really kind of interesting man. He had a lot to say about race relations at Milledgeville. But in this document, he is analyzing the utilization rates of Central State, where Black citizens were underrepresented as a percent of the state's population. There are two things I take from Dr. Gay's report, and they're not actually things that he wrote himself. Firstly, if Black people with mental illness were underutilizing mental health services in Georgia, that's probably related to the fact that, like Emma Wright in Mississippi, they were more likely to find themselves in a jail cell because of the long-running stereotype that Black folks weren't mad, they were just bad. But also, I can and do read these underutilization statistics as evidence of an active refusal. As we have seen in the work of activists like LaFleur, Black families and communities were well aware of the horrendous nature of these institutions and knew they were not safe spaces for their loved ones. The reality of white supremacist violence and the lack of therapeutic approaches enabled by both structural and internal racism signaled to Black families and patients that psychiatry and its practitioners were not to be trusted. It's not simply that racism meant that white patients were treated better, which they were, but that Black patients were not even seen as fully human and are still not. This is not simply a Southern phenomenon, although my book has tried to document the specific way that psychiatric power was enacted in the South in the wake of the plantation. Rather, it's a problem with psychiatry itself, which has much to answer for in the damage done to the Black psyche during and after slavery and into the present. Thank you.